On April 19, 1993, 76 people died inside the Mount Carmel Center near Waco, Texas. 25 of them were children. David Koresh had spent years establishing himself as the sole interpreter of biblical prophecy. He called himself the final sinful Messiah, a deliberate theological construction that made him uniquely indispensable. When the ATF raided the compound, something psychologically predictable occurred. External threat does not weaken a cult. It accelerates groupthink. Koresh had long taught that a government siege would precede the apocalypse. The raid became evidence that he was right. This is called belief perseverance under disconfirmation. The more a prediction is challenged by external reality, the more fervently it may be believed. The 51-day siege gave Koresh 51 days to deepen doctrinal control over a captive population. The government's tactical approach made the psychology worse. This was episode 11. On February 28, 1993, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agents attempted to execute a search warrant at the Mount Carmel Center, a compound near Waco, Texas. 4 agents and 6 Branch Davidians died in the initial raid. What followed was a 51-day siege that ended on April 19th when fire consumed the compound. 76 people died. 25 were children. The Waco siege is typically discussed as a law enforcement failure, a civil liberties crisis, or a political flashpoint. It was all of these things. But the clinical analysis begins earlier. Before the siege, before the raid, in the years David Koresh spent building a psychological architecture so complete that a military standoff only made it stronger. David Koresh, born Vernon Howell, had a learning disability that made conventional schooling humiliating and inaccessible. He compensated with an extraordinary talent for memorization and an obsessive engagement with biblical text. By his 20s, he had memorized significant portions of the New Testament and had developed an interpretation of the 7 seals of the book of Revelation that he claimed was uniquely his to reveal. This claim, that he alone could unlock the hidden meaning of Scripture, was the foundational assertion on which all subsequent control rested. Not charisma alone. A specific, defensible, textual argument for unique authority. Koresh's interpretive system was sophisticated enough that former members with theological training described it as genuinely compelling. He positioned himself as the final sinful Messiah, a deliberate departure from conventional messianic claims. Where traditional messiahs are pure, Koresh's theology required a sinful Messiah, one who inhabited human weakness and therefore had unique access to human experience. This construction was psychologically precise. It preemptively explained and absorbed any moral inconsistency in his behavior. When Koresh took multiple spiritual wives, including minors, it was, within his theological framework, not transgression but fulfillment of prophecy. The belief system had been constructed to make his behavior theologically necessary. The Mount Carmel Center was physically isolated, 77 acres outside Waco, without nearby neighbors or commerce. Members lived communally. Resources were controlled collectively. Koresh controlled food, sleep schedules, and sexual relationships. This cluster of control mechanisms, physical isolation, resource control, sleep disruption, sexual access, maps onto what psychologist Kathleen Taylor calls brainwashing conditions, environments in which the normal inputs of cognitive calibration are replaced entirely by the controller. Children born at Mount Carmel knew no alternative environment. Adults who arrived from outside were gradually severed from outside contacts through a combination of social pressure and geographic distance. One of Koresh's most clinically significant moves was his explicit prediction of a government siege. He taught that the Branch Davidians would face violent confrontation with governmental authorities, and that this confrontation was prophesied in the book of Revelation as the opening of the fifth seal. When the ATF raid occurred, it did not shatter the belief system. It confirmed it. This is belief perseverance under disconfirmation, the psychological phenomenon in which an event that should falsify a prediction instead deepens the believer's commitment, because the believer has a pre-built interpretive framework that absorbs the event as confirmation. The raid was, inside Koresh's cosmology, proof that he had been right all along. The 51-day siege created conditions that accelerated the psychological processes already in place. External threat increases in-group cohesion. This is among the most robustly replicated findings in social psychology. The presence of tanks, federal agents, and media outside the compound made the outside world more threatening, more alien, and more evidence of persecution. Koresh's control over information inside the compound was total. Members heard his interpretation of the siege. They did not hear alternative framings. Negotiations from outside were filtered through his cosmological lens. Offers of food were spiritual tests. Legal arguments were irrelevant to prophecy. The FBI and ATF negotiators were operating on a framework of rational self-interest. Koresh's followers were operating on an apocalyptic timeline in which rational self-interest was literally beside the point. As the siege continued, external tactical pressure increased. The FBI played loud music and the sounds of rabbits being slaughtered over loudspeakers at night. Floodlights were directed at the compound. These tactics were designed to destabilize and coerce. Their clinical effect inside a population already under siege amplified groupthink was the opposite of intended. Sleep deprivation deepened dependency on Koresh. Sensory harassment reinforced the persecution narrative. Tactical pressure made the prediction of violent confrontation more vivid and more present. The government's escalation made Koresh more believable. On April 19, 1993, following the introduction of CS gas into the compound, fire broke out. The sequence of events remains disputed. The FBI maintained the fire was set by Davidians. Internal evidence and survivor accounts suggest it may have been accidental, set deliberately by members prepared for a prophesied end, or both. 76 people died. The investigation produced no definitive single account. What the clinical record makes clear is that by April 19th, the population inside Mount Carmel had been in total coercive control conditions for years, under an acute siege for 51 days, and operating within a theological framework in which fiery apocalypse was not a horror, but a fulfillment. Waco produced two distinct political mythologies, one in which the government was the aggressor, one in which Koresh was a manipulator who sacrificed his followers. Both are partially accurate. Both miss the central clinical finding that a sufficiently complete belief system can make external intervention, even well-intentioned external intervention, function as confirmation of the very ideology being challenged. You cannot argue someone out of a position they were not argued into. This was episode 11 of the Mind Control Archives.